There's a kind of financial pressure that doesn't always show up in headlines the way it should. It's not flashy, it's not dramatic in the moment, but it quietly forces people to make some of the hardest trade-offs in their daily lives. And in 2026, one of the biggest sources of that pressure is healthcare. Because for a growing number of households, medical costs are no longer just an occasional expense. They're becoming something that competes directly with basic living. Groceries, rent, utilities, transportation. Things that used to sit in separate categories are now colliding in the same budget. And when that happens, something has to give. That's where the real story begins. Most people don't think about healthcare as a monthly burden the same way they think about rent or food. It feels unpredictable. It feels occasional. It feels like something you deal with when it comes up. But over time, those costs stack. Insurance premiums rise. Deductibles reset every year. Copays add up. Prescriptions become ongoing. And unexpected bills show up at the worst possible times. Individually, each of these might seem manageable, but together, they create a steady financial drain that slowly reshapes how people spend money. And the impact doesn't stay isolated to healthcare, it spills into everything else. Because most households are working with limited flexibility, there isn't unlimited room in a budget. So when one category grows, others have to shrink. And healthcare is one of the few categories that people can't easily avoid. You can delay buying something, you can switch to cheaper alternatives, you can cancel a subscription, but you can't ignore a medical bill the same way. You can't always choose when you need care, and you can't always control how much it costs. That lack of control is what makes healthcare pressure so different, because it doesn't give you time to adjust. It forces decisions quickly and often under stress. That's why we're seeing something that feels uncomfortable to talk about, but very real for many people. Households are starting to cut back on essentials to keep up with healthcare costs, not luxuries, essentials. People are buying less food, choosing cheaper groceries, skipping certain items entirely, not because they want to, but because something else took priority. Utilities get delayed, transportation choices get tighter, even rent becomes harder to manage in some cases. And these are not small decisions. These are trade-offs that affect daily life, and they don't feel temporary. They feel ongoing, because the pressure doesn't disappear after one bill. It continues. That's what makes this so heavy. It's not just about a single expensive moment. It's about a pattern that keeps repeating. A doctor's visit leads to a bill. A prescription leads to another cost. An unexpected issue leads to more spending. And each time, the budget has to stretch a little further until it can't stretch anymore. There's also a psychological side to this that often gets overlooked. When people start cutting back on essentials, it changes how they experience everyday life. Food is no longer just food. It becomes a calculation. Every purchase is weighed. Every decision feels more serious. And that constant awareness creates stress that goes beyond money because it affects how people feel in their own homes. It affects their sense of security, and it affects their ability to relax. That's not what people expect when they think about healthcare costs. They expect the medical part. They don't expect the ripple effect into every other part of their life. Another reason this situation is so difficult is that healthcare costs don't always feel fair or predictable. Two people can have similar situations and end up with very different expenses. Coverage can vary, billing can be confusing, costs can appear after the fact, and that uncertainty makes it harder to plan because you're not just budgeting for what you know, you're trying to prepare for what you don't, and that creates a constant sense of vulnerability. Even if things are stable right now, there's always the possibility that they won't be, that something unexpected will show up and shift everything again. So people start adjusting before that happens. They become more cautious. They reduce spending where they can. They try to create space in their budget. But when healthcare costs are already taking a larger share, that space is harder to find, which leads to those difficult trade-offs again. There's also a bigger shift happening here. For a long time, financial advice focused on cutting discretionary spending, things like dining out, entertainment, or non-essential purchases. But what we're seeing now is different. People aren't just cutting extras, they're cutting into the core of their daily living, and that changes the conversation completely.
It's about managing pressure. It's about deciding what can stay and what has to go. And sometimes those decisions don't feel like real choices. They feel like forced adjustments. That's why this topic resonates so strongly, because it reflects a reality that many people are experiencing quietly. It doesn't always show up in big announcements. It doesn't always get talked about openly, but it shows up in small, everyday decisions, the kind that slowly change how people live and how they feel about their financial situation. It also challenges the idea that financial stress only comes from big, visible expenses. Sometimes it comes from smaller costs that build over time, costs that don't seem overwhelming at first, but become overwhelming when they repeat. And healthcare is one of the clearest examples of that. It's not just the size of the bill, it's the frequency, the unpredictability, the lack of control, and the way it interacts with everything else in a household budget. So when people say that healthcare costs are forcing them to cut back on food and essentials, they're not exaggerating. They're describing a shift in how their budget works, a shift where one category has grown large enough to reshape the entire system. And once that happens, the impact spreads. It affects how people shop, how they plan, how they think about money, and how secure they feel overall. Because at the end of the day, financial stability isn't just about income. It's about whether your core needs can be met comfortably. And when healthcare starts competing with those needs, that comfort disappears. That's why this issue feels so serious, not because it's new, but because it's becoming more common and more visible in everyday life, in quiet decisions, in the small changes people make just to stay on track. So the real story here isn't just about rising healthcare costs. It's about what those costs are forcing people to give up and what that says about the state of household finances in 2026. Because when something as basic as food starts competing with something as necessary as healthcare, that's not just a budgeting issue. That's a pressure problem. And it's one that more and more people are feeling every single day.